Welcome to all our listeners. Ubuntunomics is a weekly roundup and discussion of the most important economic and political developments from Africa. Hosted by myself, Sia from PESA. PESA is a political economy think tank that promotes regional integration in SADC and provides research on the political economy of development in Africa. With me is my co-host, Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Isakombe Assets provides individuals with renewable energy assets in order to develop communities. Hi, Sbu.
Hi, Sia.
How are you today?
No, fine, thanks, man. How are you today?
I'm good. So what do you have for us in store today?
On South African stories, today I've got a couple of stories. The first one being that the South African Post Office Group has been declared by the country's Auditor General as commercially insolvent. The Auditor General 29 that the state-owned company incurred losses of over 1.7 billion rand, while its liabilities exceeded its assets by 1.5 billion. The group incurred irregular expenditure of over 200 billion rand, as well as fruitless and wasteful expenditure exceeding 26 million rand. The South African Post Office says it is operating in a difficult environment, which has seen its revenues perform below targets by 8%. The entity received recapitalization funding of around 2.89 billion in January 2019, with which they settled loans of 1 billion rand and paid outstanding creditors. The group added that it plans to expand into the e-commerce space, digitization of processes, and then focus on their courier space, as well as those activities which fall under their legal mandate.
So,
In the period,
so what happened to the previous plans they had announced? I remember soon after they had appointed a new chief executive, they made plans that they were going to expand the post office mandate into establishing a sort of state bank to administer and deliver social grants. Is that part of the plans, or has that idea just sort of died down? What happened to that?
Good question. There is no more talk about that anymore. What happened is that stricter banking amendments closed that door of inquiring a commercial banking license. You see, the post office's poor financial position prohibits them from owning a commercial license. Even the communications minister Stella Ndabeni Abrams says that only state-owned enterprises with a sound financial position can apply for a banking license. So that has been shelved, basically.
I see.
The only talk there is about the state bank, which stems from the Nasdaq resolutions. But that is another subject for another episode.
Yeah, such a pity. But look, I think the pressures that the SA Post Office is facing are not unique. The same issues that the challenge is obviously it's a dying industry and everybody is digital these days, and there's very few people who actually still receive mail except for obviously bills and other issues via mail. But yeah, it'll be interesting to watch whether they can save this industry, because it's one of the things that you need. I don't know if there's room for private. Well, maybe there is, apart from couriers. But like, I can't imagine a world where, having a private post, that'll be interesting.
But, interestingly, there's postnets popping up in every suburb. I mean, Postnet seems to be making a lot of profits. I wonder what the difference is between
But they've also had to adjust their model, right? So they don't actually service post, like they service more like sending of small parcels. And I think one of the interesting sort of marketing gimmicks they had was this 99 Rand 3-day delivery model, which allows people to send small boxes within 3 days to someone at whatever kind of postnet in another city. Or but exactly that, they've had to diversify. And there was a time when they also had little internet cafes, and a lot of that's been taken away. And I think now they just sort of do the courier thing, but like stall to stall, or sometimes to the home. But yeah, the interesting world.
Exactly.
I wonder if maybe the SA post office will be shut down. I think it probably is in the same terrain as SAA. Although some people might argue SAA is more of a pride thing, that it's one of those entities that you need and you need to run publicly rather than private. Yeah.
Yeah. Even internationally, post of the US, so it's not unique to South Africa, really. You are right here. Yeah. Another story we have today is that South Africa has determined to voluntarily suspend the rollout program of the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine after a rare type of blood clot was reported in 6 women in the US. The Food and Drug Administration advised of a temporary suspension of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine rollout in the US. And so our guys have decided to go with that advice. At the moment, 292,000 healthcare workers under the Sesonke protocol have received the jab in South Africa as of Wednesday, the 14th, which is yesterday. The Health Minister Zweli Mkhize also confirmed that the South African government have secured 30 million doses of Johnson & Johnson and 30 million other doses from Pfizer to exceed our targeted 40 million doses for this year. The price of both vaccines comes to $10 per dose, while AstraZeneca's dose was at $5.30 per dose. In the meanwhile, the South African Reserve Bank has warned of a negative impact of slow COVID-19 vaccinations. They are saying until herd immunity is reached, future waves of the virus will continue to affect our economy. To achieve its target, South Africa needs to administer between 250,000 to 300,000 vaccinations per day. At the current rate, it has been estimated by Unomics, they have a vaccination campaign tracker, that it will take 29 years to reach herd immunity.
That's so ridiculous. Clearly, they'll start speeding things up, or at least we hope, right?
Oh, we hope.
This COVID pandemic might turn out to be similar to the HIV/AIDS pandemic in South Africa. 30 years later, and we would still be dealing with. I just can't imagine that. Do you think that's where we're headed?
I think that's where we're headed, because 250,000 to 300,000 doses per day, that is unachievable in South Africa, because we've at the moment we have gone past a month and a half since we started.
No, maybe I'm just being blindly optimistic. Maybe I'm just being blindly optimistic, but I'm hoping we'll deal with COVID in the next 3 to 5 years. But look, if the HIV/AIDS pandemic is anything to go by, actually, these Unomics projections don't seem ridiculous. But, given that countries like the UK, for example, have already vaccinated over 32 million people, over 50s. So I think it is doable. I don't know. I don't think, well, it also depends on the efficacy of the vaccines, I guess.
I mean,
but I think this is a reality check. Sorry,
Even the
go ahead.
EU is struggling though, because it's one thing getting securing from your manufacturers the doses that you placing an order, and it's another thing getting those doses into your country.
Sure.
So at the moment it looks a little bit bleak, but hopefully we'll catch up. Yeah. Anyway, and my third story is about the National Treasury, which announced the extension of its ineffective 200 billion rand COVID-19 loan scheme. It will be extending that by another 3 months. The loan guarantee scheme, which was announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa on the 21st of April last year, and it was officially launched by Treasury, the South African Reserve Bank, and the Banking Association of South Africa on the 12th of May in 2020 as part of the government's economic stimulus package, which was designed to support small businesses that were experiencing COVID-19. That has been extended by another 3 months, as I said. The end of the availability period for the program was supposed to be the 11th of April to disburse 200 billion rands. And that has now been extended to to 3 months from now. Yeah. So commercial banks had up to the 27th of March only approved 14,827 loans to the value of 18 billion rand, which is a little more than 9% under this scheme. So the Banking Association has said that business owners remain reluctant to incur more debt due to the challenges presented by inconsistent policy and regulation, uncertain business conditions, and a weaker economic outlook. Commercial banks have provided support to their own business customers via their own balance sheets, totaling to at least 33 billion rand in payment relief between April and November 2020. That was my third story.
Sure.
Let me get on to my fourth story now. South Africa's economic recovery plan will focus on digital skills, says the president, while Trade Federation SAFTU rejects it as a false solution. Writing in his weekly open letter to the public, President Cyril Ramaphosa said South Africa's economic recovery plan will not see a return to previous systems, but will rather focus on digital skills by harnessing the job-creating potential of the digital economy, whose growth has only been accelerated by the coronavirus pandemic. He was citing a recent report which ranked South Africa first in the world as a destination for global business services. The president hopes that this sector will create 100,000 jobs by 2023 and 500,000 by 2030. The South African Federation of...
But hold on.
Yes.
How many jobs have we lost during COVID?
Okay. The two surveys that I have had a look at are not far apart. As you know, there is always a slight difference depending on the size of the sample used. According to Stats SA, they have a quarter labor force survey, which I prefer compared to the quarterly employment survey. The unemployment rate reached 32%, 32.5%, end 2020. It is the highest unemployment rate since the survey began in 2008. So for the first months of the lockdown, they say 2.2 million South Africans lost their jobs. I also had a look at another survey, but there's a small difference between the two. It says approximately 2.1 million additional jobs were recorded to have been lost between June and October 2020. That's the National Income Dynamics Study. So basically, between 2.2, which is Stats SA, and 2.1, so you can basically say 2.1 million jobs were lost in South Africa.
I think it's safe to say we've lost, yeah, exactly 2.1 million jobs, and we're hoping to secure another 100,000 in the next 2 years.
Look at that! It's
This
ridiculous.
is the drop of it's like a grain of sugar in the ocean. We're trying to sweeten the ocean. It's never gonna work. Wow. So I think it paints the picture of like the slow recovery we're facing in South Africa coming out of this COVID pandemic. I mean, if you just look at it in your first one, I could have told you that 200 billion loan guarantee scheme would have failed.
Yeah.
Clearly, no firms are taking on further debt without any certainty of demand. Given demand is shut down during the lockdown and people have got no incomes, have no jobs, like
And there's the
this is
austerity.
going to be a tough recovery.
And you also have an austerity budget.
Yeah,
So
at the same time.
yeah,
So there's very little stimulus, and although the global economy seems to be slowly recovering, but a large part of it still will depend on the success of the vaccination program globally. In order to unlock the restrictions or remove the restrictions on people movement, and then we'll get the whole economy sort of rejigging itself or restarting itself.
it
I'm
all
very
hinges around
worried.
that.
Sorry?
It all hinges around that. You are right. It hinges
Yeah.
around
So
that.
I'm very, very worried about these prospects of, this industry creating 100,000 jobs when we've lost 2.1 million.
I
This is
mean,
insane.
it's ridiculous. I mean, SAFTU said they read the president's letter with utter shock, calling it shameless in this economically injured country. It is unnecessary. It is necessary. It is necessarily undesirable. Yeah. They had strong words for the president. Yeah.
Obviously.
But South Africa was already in recession before March
Of
2020
course. Of
when
course.
COVID-19 hit. So the economy has been, in fact, the economy has been in and out of recession since 2015 with the rising unemployment. So yeah, it's going to be interesting how we get out of this one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
That's so bleak.
I think we can get on to African news now, Sia. What do you have for
Sure.
us this week?
So we've got quite a lot today on the rest of the continent. I think starting off with firstly, we wish our Islamic listeners a blessed month, given that this week was the start of Ramadan.
Yeah.
So Ramadan Mubarak to all our listeners, our Islamic listeners out there.
Yep.
Um, Today we'll be looking at some elections that took place last week and going back again to review some conflicts, firstly in the Central and Great Lakes region, Central African Great Lakes region, and then some analysis coming out of the Mozambique situation. The first thing is the African Union, EU, African trade blocs, and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development and the UN met last Friday to discuss the ongoing political stalemate in Somalia, over holding of delayed elections and continuing impasse on dialogue between the federal government and some federal member state leaders. Um, the deadline for holding the fresh parliamentary elections expired last December, and a planned one person, one vote presidential election has been delayed until leaders can agree on a way forward. The current agreement led by Mohammed Abdullah Mohammed is no longer recognized by 2 of the 5 states in Somalia. And his 4-year presidential terms officially ended prior to the parties reaching an agreement on how to conduct the fresh elections in terms of basically reviewing their election model in Somalia. As a result, the AU and other parties, EU, IGAD, and the UN, have emphasized that the party should stick to the 17 November 2020 agreement, where the president and the 5 regional leaders agreed on a revised election model, which remains a viable path that the parties can agree to, which is obviously the soonest way that which they can hold elections in Somalia.
But where? So when will that be? Is it a year, months? Any proposed date, or is it one of those that will drag on and on and on?
Look, initially the 17 September agreement had put together a sort of time frame, which was supposed to end in early February with the elections taking place. We're now in the second or mid-April, and we still haven't seen the election. I don't think the parties have really agreed on a way forward, although the 17 September agreement includes a model which they were then supposed to agree on certain aspects on how the voting would take place. But still, the 2 parties, the 2 states leaders still not recognizing that model as something that's viable for them, although parties have sort of initially agreed to that framework as a way forward. And I think this also puts at risk very fragile stability that's been achieved in Somalia. Very worrying.
Yes.
The next bit of news is from Djibouti, which held its first round of presidential elections last Friday. And the AU observer mission released preliminary findings that in most cases, the voting process took place in an orderly, transparent, and professional manner. But election was also characterized by internal tensions, with most opposition candidates boycotting the election. And only 2 candidates actually were approved by the Constitutional Council, being the incumbent president, Ismail Omar Guelleh, and his opponent, Zakaria Ismail Farah, who totally lost the elections. So President Guelleh has been re-elected for his 5th term, winning 97.4% of the votes out of a very high turnout of 97.3. But some of this is quite concerning if you look at the numbers, given that the country is around just less than 200,000 registered voters in a country of, I think, 2 million or just over, around 2 million citizens. So it's one of those elections that I think President Guelleh now has reached the status of presidents like President Kagame, who's also in his 5th term, also around these strongman levels of votes, around 97% of the votage.
Is there a possibility that these elections can be challenged in their courts? So, I mean, such a big margin makes it look like some sort of dictatorship in there.
Precisely. I didn't want to say the big D word.
Yeah.
But well, they can. They can challenge the election result. The election result hasn't been confirmed as yet by the Constitutional Council, after which the president is inaugurated in his 5th term. However, given the margins, there's so little chance that any challenge would actually yield any change in the actual result of the elections. It's also President Guelleh's 5th term. So I think even if they were to rehold elections, he's more likely to win, given that they've played. But apparently the other candidates have chosen to boycott the elections in their own volition. But if your Constitutional Council only approves 2 candidates, also already you kind of see where The people are given limited options. And I think this has been a criticism that despite African countries still, running some elections with peaceful outcomes without sort of post-election violence, that there's actually a shrinking democratic space in that the process of verification and approval of candidates often leads voters down this particular path with limited competition, really, for the actual candidacies. But
I won't talk about the African Union. I won't ask you anything about them.
Precisely. I think touche. The next story is from Benin, which also held its first round of presidential elections this week. And the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, released its observer mission preliminary findings and stating that the voting process also took place orderly, transparent, in a professional manner. The secrecy of the ballot was generally observed. But the election didn't take place in some places of the country, some voting stations, mainly due to difficulty to access caused by some disgruntled stakeholders. But I think by and large, the elections have taken place without any major sort of disruptions. And according to Seni, President Talon has been re-elected for a second term with 86.4% of the votes out of a 50.2% voter turnout. Meanwhile, Talon's opponents, Alassane Soumano and Corentin Kahu, received 11.3 and 2.3% of the votes, respectively.
Now, Benin has long been praised as a thriving multi-party democracy, but critics have recently been saying that Talon has steered the country into authoritarianism, with a steady crackdown on and sidelining his opponents. How true are these reports?
Well, look, I think it's also part of the character of the politics in West Africa, in that sometimes, I'm just thinking of President Ouattara in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, whom people have had the same criticisms that he's cracked down on opposition, he's become a strong man. But if you speak to the Ivorians and the Beninois, similar, and I've been to both countries, you don't get a sense of major repression, or at least not systematic repression. Obviously, I think for those who are with ambitions for political office, maybe would tell you a different story. But generally, I find that these leaders are people whom the mass population actually accept in a way, or that. And when you speak to some of our or some analysts about the general relationship and whether or not they, views in public are suppressed in any way, you get the response that the president actually knows his people, and that he's actually the good president in terms of stability, as well as, which is a prerequisite, obviously, for sustainable growth and development. And I think you're seeing this in the turnarounds that we're seeing in Sierra Leone, in Cote d'Ivoire, obviously, and I think same thing with Benin and Talon. And I think, it's also the similar type situation in Rwanda, right? Where people would criticize President Kagame as, is he a strong man? Is he a dictator? But does provide for stability in the country and has galvanized the country out of a very divided past, from '94 genocide. So I think it's part of the terrain of being surrounded by semi-failed states, and I'm thinking in West Africa region, definitely in the case of some of the countries which have got internal terrorism challenges, and thinking of Chad as well, and Niger, which we spoke about last week, facing internal conflict. That part of the politics and the terrain in those countries requires people who are firm, with firm leadership. But I still maintain maybe Talon is on his way up towards proving himself. Obviously, Benin has a constitutional restriction on re-election. I think they've got a term limit of 2. So I think after this, they'll have to find someone else to succeed. But looking at his votership winnings compared to President Guille of Djibouti, he's not in the 97%. And those are the levels at which people start saying he's a strong man, dictator. But I don't think that that's necessarily the case with Talon.
Yeah, let's hope it doesn't turn out to be a Benin.
But maybe our viewers and listeners from Benin have got something to say. So it'll be interesting to hear if any people have comments or any different views on this. Please write to us. You can also email us, write to us on our social media, or even email us on info@ubuntunomics.co.za. All right. So the next story is about Chad, which also held its first round of presidential elections this week. And the African Union Election Observer Mission released preliminary findings that in most cases voting took place orderly and transparent, and there was secrecy observed. But the elections were also categorized by internal tensions, with only 10 out of 17 presidential presidential candidates being validated by the Supreme Court. And in addition, 3 presidential candidates withdraw due to excessive use of public force against opposition. Nevertheless, the incoming Chad leader will be seized with the fight against terrorism. And again, the story we were just talking about earlier, Smo, is resurfacing. Incumbent President Idris Deby, who has served 5 consecutive terms since seizing power in 1990 coup d'etat, is among the candidates seeking for a 6th term. We're still waiting to find out the results from that election.
Let me ask you this time, were there any other external election observers besides the EAU in that country?
In Chad? No, yes, I don't know. I don't know. I would have to do some research on this. I would imagine the West African Economic Community of West African State, ECOWAS, yes, would have been involved or would have sent a mission, but they didn't put anything up on the Chad election in terms of releases of their findings. I don't know if they even sent an election observer mission. But perhaps we'll follow up on this when the election results come out. We'll have to wait and see.
France and the West, which are always vocal about long stays at the helm by most African leaders, they've been quiet. Have you heard anything from that front?
No. But you know how the policy of France-Afrique works, yes. It's riddled with inconsistencies, and it only serves the interest of France. You know what it is.
Yes.
I mean, same view they've got on presidents like Paul Biya in Cameroon. I forget, president in Republic of Congo. And, these presidents are also part of economic communities where, like I said, with Benin, 2-term limit.
Yes.
Yet the, France-Afrique policy would have an inconsistent view on these presidents. They'll criticize Talon, although he is running under a constitutional limit of 2 terms, but will probably say nothing about the Chadian president. So France-Afrique doesn't serve our interests, and we know it's riddled with inconsistencies.
Yeah, whatever suits France. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Yes.
The next story is UN Security Council has revised its strategy of dealing with the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, particularly in North and South Kivu. And they've issued a new strategy to prevent conflict and consolidate peace in the Great Lakes region in order to bring fresh support to the leaders working to end the violence by armed groups, especially in those eastern provinces I've mentioned. And the process of diplomatic relations has been categorized as being on track by the UN Security Council. And they've given the leaders of the Great Lake regions countries, especially President Felix Tshisekedi of the DRC and President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, commendation for their hard work towards finding a lasting solution to the ongoing violence being committed by the arms groups in the eastern regions. The framework is supported by the UN, African Union, and the ICGLR, which is the International Conference of Great Lakes Region, as well as SADC, who plan to convene their first meeting to oversee the non-military measures to assist in the neutralization of the armed force next week.
Have the many rebel forces hiding in the dense forests of the Kivu province been engaged on the matter, or have they been invited to the talks? And how feasible is this peace deal that excludes them, if they are excluded?
So I think the approach is that I don't think they've engaged the belligerents. The view is that the rebel forces in the Kivu forests are definitely considered to be considered to be belligerent, and I don't think that they were part of any of these negotiations. Obviously, the biggest thing that has kept the conflict ongoing, and it'll be interesting to see whether because for example, there have been conflicting roles played by neighboring states' presidents in their involvement in the military rebel groups in North and South Kivu. You might remember that there was a March 23 rebel group in the
Yes, I
DRC
remember those guys.
that threatened to overthrow Kagame's regime, to which he then supported the FDLR, which was um, the force that was against Democratic Republic of Congo's defense force, and so they've been playing the different forces against one another. Same thing with Burundi and their rebel group, the Red Tabara, as well as the Joseph Kony's group, which fled from Uganda under Idi Amin. Oh, excuse me, at the beginning, in the coups that Museveni won against what they call themselves, the IDA, who are also the whole North-South Kivu situation is a melting pot of all these rebel groups. So firstly, I think it's difficult to reach, and that's why the conflict has been ongoing, because it's a very remote area. Secondly, there's been illicit trade in resources that's still been ongoing in the region despite the conflict. Actually, the conflict has been fueled partly by the illicit trade in mineral resources.
Coltan.
Excuse me?
That's the mineral that they use on our phones.
Coltan, yes, coltan.
Yes.
Which is a critical resource used in electronics and cell phones, etc. And this is also partly how these rebel groups have survived within those forests. And this is obviously apart from the involvement of neighboring countries instigating or supporting different sides depending on their national interest. As I mentioned, with presidents in Rwanda, Burundi, as well as Uganda. I mean, this is also reminiscent of the role of Zimbabwe and the apartheid regime of South Africa in the civil war in Mozambique, which we spoke about last week, and how they would support Renamo and Renamo in response to what they considered a sort of socialist or communist threat of Frelimo following independence in Mozambique. So really, it's quite interesting to see whether there is a lasting commitment, given that these neighboring countries have also been involved in instigating the conflict, and it has been in their interest. For example, countries like Rwanda have only recently started exporting gold, which people have been questioning as to where, on which mines is Rwanda exporting gold from. But in the sort of trafficking of illicit trafficking of resources, the neighboring countries have also been complicit in the conflict in the Great Lakes region. And I've always felt that a solution needs to come from a sort of trilateral approach of SADC, the ICGLR, but also the UN, which has also been stationed in the DRC for the longest time. The UN
Yes.
mission in the DRC has not succeeded much in, if you look at the ongoing conflict, which is considered the second longest sort of refugee internal displacement conflict in the world after the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in the West Bank. So, and the DRC conflict has seen, I think, 6 million people killed over the last few decades. It's a serious conflict. I don't know whether this new strategy is going to deliver, though. But I think one thing I can commend it for is taking extra military response in terms of it being a more than just a response in the force, but looking at providing humanitarian assistance for some of the civilians who are finding themselves in sort of the danger zone where the conflict is happening. But I think until they can dismantle the illicit or parallel economy that's running the conflict, there is
Yeah.
no real prospect of the conflict ending.
And the UN has got about 16,000 armed forces the last time I heard. So there are many factors to that war. Okay, you
And,
see, uh-huh.
and I think the last point I want to make is the other challenge has been the coordination between the military forces, the DRC National Defense Force, as well as the UN force. Firstly, it was an issue as to whether they can execute offensive missions
Yes.
and also the narrow mandate of peacekeeping, which in many cases is a response when it's often far too late and
Uh-huh.
the rebels have either escaped or the conflict and the death has already taken place and it's being ineffective, really. And then there was a
Yes.
challenge of coordination between the Domestic National Defense Force of the DRC and this peacekeeping force,
Yes.
which has not been good. I mean, you hear stories such as um, the Defense Force military being bribed by some of the rebels um, in terms of information sharing in order to avoid areas where the UN force is peacekeeping. Also, because the UN force cannot actually have offensive operations, they
Yeah.
are really, in terms of the mandate, stuck to just responding in peacekeeping, and their involvement is very limited. Um, so yeah, I don't know if there is really an immediate response or a quick solve to that conflict.
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
then moving right along, in East Africa, where things are heating up again, the UN Human Rights Council issued a statement appealing to Tanzanian and Burundi authorities to respect the rights of refugees and asylum seekers who have fled Burundi for Tanzania. Burundi refugees have suffered violations such as arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances, allegedly carried out by Tanzanian police and intelligence services in cooperation with counterparts from their homeland, Burundi. Hundreds of thousands of people fled Burundi for neighboring countries following deadly clashes surrounding the 2015 presidential elections. While the worst of the violence has eased, the situation remains fragile. And nearly half of those who escaped, or around 150,000 people, are in Tanzania. And Burundian intelligence agencies posing as refugees within the camps are identifying specific individuals who are then later arrested by Tanzanian security forces.
Has the situation back in Burundi not improved since the death of the former strongman president Kurunziza? What seems to be the major point of contention in that beautiful country?
Well, it's still linked to the ethnic challenges. Burundi being south of Rwanda is almost like a split mirror image of Rwanda in that everything that we now know publicly about the Hutu and Tutsi fight and the genocide of '94 pretty much mirrors the reality and the tensions in Burundi. So the challenge is that the country is majority Hutu in terms of the population, which is mainly about 80% of the population is Hutu. However, the Tutsi are historically have been historically in control of the military in Burundi, and this has caused tensions and unequal balance of power between these two ethnic groups. Has led to bloodshed and huge genocides in the country. Actually, so that really is ethnic-based violence. Obviously, with the historical involvement of the Belgians during the colonial period, which is really where a lot of these the violence both in Rwanda and in Burundi stem from, which is a sort of dividing of cultures that are pretty much similar and speak a language that's almost indistinguishable from the differences. Yet, despite this, have fought each other to the very end. Almost again, that is what we had in South Africa under the apartheid government between Xhosa and Zulu speaking people with the ANC IFP fights. All right. So the next story is from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which has called on the government of Uganda to immediately stop the brutal crackdown on its political opponents, which began in the lead up to January's disputed general elections and continues to suppress opposition supporters. The government of Uganda has allegedly killed more than 50 people and arrested several thousands. Several thousand people have been arrested, and while some have been released, others are allegedly been tortured before appearing in military courts. And the UN Commissioner for Human Rights has called for an end to the extrajudicial killings, arbitrary arrests and detention, enforced disappearances, torture and ill treatment, deprivation of due process, and assault on freedoms of expression and peaceful assembly in Uganda.
Yeah.
This is very concerning, and I
Yes.
remember watching some of the news as military forces were assaulting civilians, firing indiscriminately at buildings using live ammunition. I really do hope, well, it also goes to show the fragility of these terms that, 30 years on, Museveni still
Yeah.
president and refusing to let go. And really, he's used every trick in the book, from constitutional amendments to changing his birth date to like it's really astonishing. And I remember watching his interview on CNN and completely sort of rubbishing any accusations that the last elections were were under excessive use of force. Clearly, we've seen that there was excessive use of force and indiscriminate firings in public in civilians. So this is very concerning for the East African region. And the last story today is the UN Children's Fund issued a statement that the Cabo Delgado region in North Mozambique is facing a large and likely long-lasting humanitarian crisis, with nearly a third of the population displaced, worsening hunger, and rising risk of deadly disease. The region has been plagued by insecurity since 2017, but the situation worsened dramatically last month as militant extremists attacked and overran the town of Pemba, killing dozens of people and uprooting thousands, many of whom had fled violence elsewhere. According to the UN International Organization for Migration, more than 17,000 people have been on the move since the violence last month, with women and children accounting for almost 74% of those displaced.
Any news about a possible intervention from the SADC Troika, which met recently?
No, so remember we had this discussion last week, and
Last week,
the only
yes.
thing that they've agreed to is the technical deployment. And I don't know what more information that SADC could be looking to find about Cabo Delgado conflict that isn't already being covered.
Mhm.
And they have until the 28th of April to report back to the SADC Troika and in terms of the technical deployment. So that's really where the SADC response is at the moment. But again, this speaks to partly what we discussed last week as to people saying the conflict, the response shouldn't just be a military response. And even above and beyond that, we should be talking about a humanitarian response to the conflict in Cabo Delgado, given that it affects so many people. People are internally displaced, and you know the fact that 74% of the people displaced are women and children is
Yeah,
also quite concerning.
it just shows that underdevelopment in Africa is still a big problem because just now you were talking about the Kivu provinces in the DRC, which are underdeveloped,
Sure.
and now Cabo
Exactly.
Delgado, same story. So
I think, yeah, and I think it's also partly, so I bring it down to two things. One is, I think, benign neglect of the national governments.
mhm.
Obviously, that region in Cabo Delgado, in Mozambique, is also a region that's been used by Renamo in terms of, and also Portuguese forces during the
Yes,
Civil War and the War for Independence. Secondly, it being geographically kind of isolated makes it also very difficult for government to reach. And seemingly, um, uh, African states don't seem to have a full grasp over their whole geographic regions. And I think for me, this is partly due to the arbitrary nature of the geographic borders,
yes,
because they weren't developed out of an organic political process of state formation, but rather the conquest of Africa through European powers, right? Who literally, certain borders on the continent are drawn by pipelines in terms of gas extraction and
yeah,
oil extraction. Certain in Southern Africa and many parts are also due to geographic features such as lakes, which they couldn't cross or they needed to be shared. And so the states inevitably that post colonialism African leaders have inherited have been states which don't have a full access, firstly, to all the regions or full control. And this is the same thing across the continent.
mhm,
If you look at Angola, there's the Cabinda region, which is separated between mainland Angola by the Republic of Congo. We look at
yeah,
the Democratic Republic of Congo itself. I mean, on the far east, it can't reach its two provinces,
mm,
uh, and North and South Kivu, just because of underdevelopment largely. And again, I think it is this nexus of the way in which the geographic borders of states have developed, which is not through the organic political process of African development, but rather the conquest by external parties, which have then left, and those borders have remained unchallenged. I mean, part of the African Union founding statutes is
is
the
to
fact that
live,
we
yeah.
should do not question the borders. Um, but I think often people fear that the questioning of borders is driven by a question of, countries blaming each other for taking over land, the
Yes.
same way, the apartheid government has sort of usurped some lands in our neighboring countries, Namibia, Botswana, for example, Lesotho and Eswatini, which they claim, for example, the Basotho kingdom extends all the way past Vicksburg into parts of the Free State in South
Uh,
Africa,
uh,
according to some people from Lesotho. However, the current status is that Lesotho does not reach Free State. It's surrounded by Free State. But the point I'm trying to make is that the nexus of these borders, which are arbitrary, and the development of domestic states and state development in Africa is a process that has not been natural, and hence you got what is characterized as failed or weak states. But it's not necessarily by their own doing all the time. It is also due to this unnatural process of the establishment of our geographic borders. And hence you see breakaways, for example, splits in South Sudan and Sudan, and people seceding themselves from the main country is as a result of this. And it's a very, very concerning, because although part of the challenge is that the national development doesn't allow the state to reach there, and national development has a deficit in terms of infrastructure, but also these places become hotbeds of conflict. And
like Somalia, which one?
Exactly, where people feel neglected by the central state. And then if you have a federal state system also, the autonomy that they feel that they should have, whilst also falling under the national state, that is not consistent. Hence you get conflicts like you have in Ethiopia, precisely. So these are very, very, very fundamental issues of state formation that keep African countries at a disadvantage. I think on that sad note, it's the end of our second episode.